Hebrews chapter 2 this morning. I'm just kidding. Hebrews chapter 2 this morning. And we're going to get to Hebrews 2 through Luke 24. Hebrews chapter 2. If you need a Bible, there's one in the seat back on the ends of the rows. So we'd love to make sure you get a Bible. We're going to go right through this text this morning together. I remember back in college, like many college people, young people do, we did some crazy things. Now, I went to a Bible college, so they weren't quite as crazy as some of you, but we did innocent crazy things. Like, for example, we had a roommate in our suite area who every day when he started brushing his teeth, he would actually swallow the toothpaste instead of spitting it out. Well, interesting, on the back of Crest or Colgate, it says, harmful if swallowed. And so they had a 1-800 number that you could call if you swallowed toothpaste. And so one night we're sitting there, got nothing better to do, and this guy is sharing with us that he keeps swallowing his toothpaste. So we call the 1-800 number and say, what do we do? This guy for 20 years has been swallowing his toothpaste. Is he going to die? And it was hilarious because the lady on the other end was dumbfounded from Colgate, and she was like, is he passed out? Is he having trouble breathing? And we're like, no, we've just been doing it for 20 years. We want to make sure he's not going to fall over dead. So we did things like that. And I remember one specific time where a group of roommates, we decided to try to figure out how long a car could run on empty. And so we filled a gas can and we got in the car and we said, let's drive on E as long as we can. Let's figure out exactly how far we can go while the car is on empty. And so we got in the car with our gas can and we drove. And it was amazing in a world today of hybrids and long gas mileage. We went 80 some miles on E before it actually stalled on the side of a road. It was great, a lot of fun, stuff like that. But that reminds me, as we think about the resurrection, this event that should absolutely so overwhelm our lives, so unique to any other belief in the world, right? I mean, Buddha's last words were strive to do right. Jesus' last words were it is finished. Big difference. That the reality of the resurrection should so overwhelm and fill our lives that it involves every area, that it overwhelms every area that we live. And yet so many people in our world are living on E. They're living on empty. They're acting as if there isn't something that has overwhelmed our lives, that has overfilled us. I mean, let's be honest this morning. We hate emptiness, don't we? I mean, I don't like an empty plate unless I'm filled. I don't like an empty cup. I want to go refill it. I don't like an empty gas tank. I don't like an empty house. I don't like an empty feeling. I don't like emptiness. I think we as a culture, we resist things that are empty. We like things to be filled. But there is one thing that probably we can all agree upon, and I would dare say that even culture and society would scream to us that they want empty, and that is the grave. I think if we were being overwhelmingly honest this morning, the reality is in all of culture, in all society, there is a deep hunger and a deep thirst for the grave to be empty. In fact, we go to funerals and we ride by cemeteries, and there's a bit of morbidity in us that wants us to drive by a little bit faster, that wants to get past it because it just depresses us, because the overwhelming reality of death is emptiness to us. We want the grave to be empty. We want the tomb to be opened. We don't want to go there. We fear it. We fear in many ways. We fear that although we sing these songs, if we're being honest, deep in us, we desire and long for resurrection. I want to prove this to you for a moment. In society, even in our culture, there is a yearning for resurrection. There's a yearning for death to be accomplished. I don't know if you read any articles, but it was interesting, an article in the paper. This is in a national paper, but it was written by a group of immortalists. And the article said this: we may already know how we cure death, but should we? And this research has been done with a group called immortalists who are trying to figure out scientifically how death could be conquered. And what they have found is at the end of our DNA, every person's DNA strip, there is something called a telometer. At the end is this telometer, which is a little head to every DNA. And what happens over time is that telometer begins to die. It begins to shrink. It begins to go away. And the moment the DNA stops or dies, you cease to exist. And so what they're trying to figure out, these immortalists, is how they can extend the head of the DNA, how they can extend the telomere so that you and I would live longer. Listen to this. The end of the article says this. If humans could live forever, and this is their point, is if we can just learn how to take a pill and extend the telomere of the DNA, then what would happen is you could live on forever and ever. And it says this, if humans could live forever, it would transform our civilization in ways more profound than just about any other technological breakthrough. Lifelong marriage, already on the ropes, and the age of ever-lengthening lifespans would cease to make sense. Overpopulation might become an issue, but population wouldn't be necessary. The cost of war might have to be reevaluated. We could live long enough for humans to reach other stars. And then it says one of the falling points is young people might be unable to compete for a job since a bunch of experienced 200-year-old people are having them. This is the yearning. By the way, this is millions of taxpayer dollars are going to fund the immortalists to try to figure out how life can be extended. Or take, for example, Hollywood. Hollywood seems to be the picture of what society is really thinking. Have you seen this new show brought on by ABC? Here's their trailer for this new show. You probably have seen it. Take a look at this clip, the trailer for this new show.
Bellamy, did your son go missing, sir?
I haven't. My son died 32 years ago.
It's when a green goes a million miles per hour.
Frog in a blender.
Daddy!
Honey, who is it?
Jacob. I'm coming home. I'm coming home. Tell the world I'm coming.
Isn't it interesting that even in society, Hollywood has grabbed to the reality with a new show on ABC that started in March, this desire in us for resurrection. I mean, even Hollywood grasps that we fear death, that we want an answer, that we want an out, that we want to find a way to escape the emptiness that we experience in understanding death. Now, I want to begin here in Luke chapter 24 to paint the picture of this resurrection. Then we're going to talk about Hebrews chapter 2. It says this in Luke chapter 24, and many of you probably know this passage. It is the resurrection passage. It says this, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. Now, realize right from the very beginning of the story, Jesus dies on a cross. He's in the grave for 3 days. As was custom to the Jewish people, 3 days authenticated that the person was dead. And they took spices. So here, these women going to the tomb clearly understood and expected to see death. They expected to take the spices to be able to put around the body of the one who had died, Jesus, in order to keep the smell down and also to commemorate the person. This is what they would do. This was custom in their day. And so they went to the tomb expecting death. You know what happens? And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of Jesus. Now look at this. It takes another step for us. Not only did they come to the grave expecting someone dead, they came to the grave even after they saw the stone rolled away, expecting the dead body to be inside. So they expected this to be death. They expected the body to be inside. And so they walked in, and then they saw, wait a minute, the body's not here. Jesus is not here. Verse 4, while they were perplexed about this, by the way, I think that word perplex is meant to be funny. That's an understatement there. 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel, and as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified on the 3rd day and rise? Verse 8, and they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. I find it very interesting. They come to the tomb expecting death. These angels meet them and says, he is not here, for he is risen, just as he said. Do you remember his words? And it's like it caught them. And it says, then they remembered his words. It was like they had a senior moment. Some of you know what that's like, right? They get to the tomb, they're expecting this dead body, and the angels say, no, don't you remember what he said? Oh, he did say that. I didn't grasp that. I didn't remember that he said he was going to rise again. You know why they didn't pay attention to it, right? He had said on 5 occasions, by the way, throughout the Gospels, he implied it many other times, but 5 times he told them he was going to rise again. They didn't grasp it. They didn't get it. They didn't let it overwhelm them life. In fact, they were empty at this moment, and they didn't expect to be filled by the resurrection, even though Jesus said, hey, be filled by this. I'm going to rise again. They show up, and they didn't expect it. And then they remembered the words of Jesus. Now, I realize probably all of us here have heard this story. We have all here probably heard the story of the resurrection. We're here this morning because we're celebrating Easter. Some of you, you're here, right, because we're celebrating Easter. But I have found this story to be a bit of a bother for some people. Because let's be honest, it is a little bit awkward and a little bit weird that this takes place. Like, think about what we believe as Christians. Isn't it weird? I mean, just consider, I've heard people say to me before, so you're telling me that a man was killed and 3 days later he rose again, and that's what you hinge your faith on? Yeah, pretty much, right? A virgin gives birth to a son. He lives a perfect life. He is then put on the cross because he was perfect and claims to be God. 3 days later, he rises again. He hangs out with his friends for 40 days and then ascends into heaven and says he's coming back on a white horse. You believe that? Yeah, that's it. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a little crazy. But that's what we believe, and it is a bit crazy to a world. In fact, the scripture says it is foolishness to the world. But please know this morning that what we believe is not just a faith-based idea. What we believe is actual reason. It makes sense. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes that there were over 500 people who saw Jesus after he rose again. What we believe is not just based upon faith, it is an appeal to reason. He was seen. There were eyewitnesses. Peter ate with him. John saw him. Thomas touched him. He was there in their presence. So this morning, it's not blind faith that we believe the resurrection. It is actual reason and intellectual understanding that we believe in the resurrection. But I don't want to spend time there this morning. We're going to talk about this in a few weeks, and we're going to give out some great material to help us be able to communicate this. But I want to focus to us this morning who know this story, who are here celebrating this story, but maybe we're not living the fullness of what the resurrection actually should bring us. Because we know the death and resurrection of Christ, but now what? Now how do we live? How is it filling our lives? How are we living the resurrection? It's interesting, Wednesday night we have our real family, this ministry of families meet together and we have a great time. And I was talking to one little guy, he's about 4 years old, and I walked up to him this past Wednesday and I said, hey buddy, are you ready for Easter? He's like, yeah, he's all excited, right? You ready for Easter? I said, so what is Easter all about? Can you tell me what Easter's all about? And he said, it's about the fact that Jesus died again. I thought, that's awesome. His parents have taught him well. And so I was then asked him after he said, Jesus died. I expected him then to say, and Jesus rose again. So I said, well, what else happened? And I was expecting him to pontificate. Yes, he was our substitutionary atonement, and then he walked out of the grave on the 3rd day, according to the scriptures. And I was expecting, some theological conversation. And instead, he responds, Jesus died for us, and then we get to eat chocolate bunnies. Now, I know his parents, and I know they've taught him well, and I don't think they probably have focused on the chocolate bunnies. But folks, can we be real honest? Most of us here probably really do understand that Jesus rose again, that the facts are the facts, and it is reasonable to believe that, and it's something that we base our faith on. But we're probably not living our life based upon the reality of it. That there's still a world of a lot of emptiness, and there's still a lot of Christians that live empty lives. While we know it to be true, we're not living the reality of it. I mean, think about it for a moment. Think about it for a moment. I mean, in a lot of us, we say, yes, Jesus has rose again. Now let's wear pastels. In fact, Barna Research just did a study on Easter. Some of you will get that later. And they found this. In our country, 42%, now I know Barna Research, and I'm not saying they're the experts of all, but they do research, and they found that 42% of Americans understand that the resurrection is the focus of Easter. And yet, according to their study, only 1 in 50, or 2%, said that it affects their faith. Think about that. 42% of Americans say, yes, Easter is wrapped in the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but only 2% admit it to actually living their life based upon the reality of what we celebrate today. The Bible makes abundantly clear to us And by the way, this is commonplace in our world today where we get it, but we don't live it. The Bible speaks of this as something a bit deeper for us. So the resurrection is deeper than just the fact that Jesus conquered the grave. In fact, Paul writes in Colossians this phrase. He says that there are things that have happened that Jesus did that are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is Jesus. The whole point is that these are shadows. Now, you and I are not going to wrap our arms around shadows. We're not going to grab the shadows. We're not going to be overwhelmed by shadows. But there's something deeper that we're supposed to understand by the things that happen. There is something deeper this morning that you and I should grasp because of the reality of the resurrection. There is something deeper that we should be living as a result of it. In fact, let me just say to you, I think Jesus had this understanding. Did Jesus have to have the stone rolled away from the tomb? You know, if you go a couple chapters later, he's walking into the midst of the disciples, and it says he walks right through the walls. Did he need the stone to be rolled away from the tomb? Absolutely not. So the question is, why was the stone rolled away from the tomb? Because there's something deeper that stone, that tomb was meant to bring to us and bring to our mind. It was a shadow of something deeper that Christ wants to show us. It was to demonstrate the reality of the resurrection in our lives. Jesus didn't need it. And so what I want to do is focus here on Hebrews chapter 2, which I think gives us some of the answer. And I want to talk about not only what are we saved from because of the cross. We are saved from sin, from wrath, from death. We are saved from the penalty of sin. We are saved from hell as a result of the cross. But the resurrection saves us to something. It saves us for something. It reminds us that life can be filled, that there is a reason to live this morning, that there is a reason to live our lives filled with the reality of the resurrection. Take a look here at Hebrews chapter 2. And this is where we're going to spend some time this morning. Hebrews chapter 2. Let me explain the situation that is happening in the book of Hebrews. This is the Jewish people. These are the Hebrews that are scattered abroad. Many of them are under great persecution. And the writer of Hebrews is writing to them for multiple reasons. First of all, there is great fear among the Hebrews. They are being put to death. They're afraid. They're afraid of death. They're afraid of suffering. They're afraid of the process of dying. Some of them are going to die horrific deaths. So there's a great fear. There's also great discouragement. Some of them are saying, wait a minute, I've given my life to Jesus, but why are all these things happening? Why does it seem life is difficult? Why does it seem so empty? So if you study Hebrews, you find in chapter 1 that the writer of Hebrews begins the entire book by saying this line. If you want to know the theme of Hebrews, here's the theme. It's Jesus is better. Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than the prophets. Jesus is better than anything else. That's where Hebrews begins. In fact, what the writer of Hebrews does is corresponds Jesus with all the false gods that the Gentiles had. Of course, the Gentiles have many false gods. They had gods like Olympus and gods like Apollo and gods like, all these, Pluto, Mercury. They had these false gods. And here's what happened. The writer of Hebrews says, listen, our God is not like those other gods. He is above them. He is far greater than them. He has shown himself. He is powerful. He's not fake. But then he comes to chapter 2, and what he does is says, but I want to show you our God has done something different. Our God is actually real, and he actually came. He's not on a mountain somewhere expecting you to give a sacrifice. He came and sacrificed himself. Take a look at verse 5. He gives us this argument as to why we can trust Jesus, why Jesus is better. Take a look at verse 5, and we're going to see his argument. We're going to talk about his argument through this text. Verse 5. Now, it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you would care for him? You made him, talking about man, a little lower, for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. He says here, this is who we were. Here is exactly who we were. We were in creation, and he's defining this argument. And first of all, he says, here's who you are. Here's who you were. This is what it was like. Is in Psalm 8. He quotes Psalm 8 here, and he says in Psalm 8, here's who you were. You were people created with dominion. It's interesting, the word dominion literally means to fill by trampling under your feet. It means that everything is yours. You have control. Notice that verse says we have all control of these things. This is who we were. In fact, take a look at Genesis. Genesis says this in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. In the creation story, it says that God says to them, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. He goes on and says, I want you to fill it. I want you to enjoy it. It's all for you. The writer of Hebrews says this is where we were. This is who we were, that God had created us to have dominion. He created it to be under our feet. He gave us control over it all. You talk about a filling world. I mean, it was all for us. It was all there. We subjected it under our feet. We trampled on it because it filled us. It was all that we desired and wanted. Right there in Genesis, he gave it all to us. Now, what happens? Now, you know the story. What ends up happening? Notice the writer of Hebrews, what he says. The end of verse 8. But at present, we do not yet see everything in subject to him. So here is God. He creates man, and he gives him glory and honor, and he gives him dominion, but we don't see that today. Man, open up the newspaper. What do you see? Turn on the news. What do you see? There's emptiness. There's death. In fact, notice what he says. Go down to verse 14 and look at the middle of that verse. It says that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, verse 15, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. He says here, you know what? Who we were people with dominion, but what we became, this is what we became. We became people with no dominion. We became people that are empty. We became people that had nothing. Why? Because we sinned. The Bible says there in Genesis 3 that we fell from God. We sinned. We chose the creation rather than the creator. And Romans 3 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 6 says, the wages of sin is death. And here the writer of Hebrews says, listen, we all have experienced the broken world of the fall. In fact, he says, you want to know the pinnacle of the broken world is the fact that we fear death. Verse 15, we fear death and we're enslaved to it. We're enslaved to it. Now, let's pause here for a moment because I want this reality to sink in for a moment. If you had to probably pick, if we're all being honest this morning, you had to pick the thing that you fear the most. I am not a big fan of spiders. I'm admitting that. And don't you dare try to bring a spider like into my office or something. I will go West End on you. Right? If I'm being honest, yeah, I fear death. I fear spiders, but the reality is in the core of me, I fear death. And there's something about death that's just weird to me, right? I mean, let's just pause for a moment. Let's just sink in. You and I are easy to kill. We are impossibly fragile. I mean, no matter what precautions you take. I know I go over to Planet Fitness. Little shout out, Planet Fitness. I mean, you could tell, obviously, I've been to Planet Fitness. I'm just kidding. And I go over there and I work out, right? But I don't know about you, but at any moment, I could be on that treadmill and I could slip and that thing start rolling my face over and I'm done. I can be on the elliptical working out and that bar hit me right in the head. I almost had it happen a couple times where that bar coming back at me and my feet are going and I bend down and this thing almost hits me in the head and I'm out, I'm gone, right? I mean, a drive in the car down 81, your life could end. We know that. We've seen it recently. You go on a plane, it could end. We've seen this recently in our world. I mean, we are impossibly fragile. Somebody sharing an article with me recently that said hiccups are bad for you. I always thought they're the most hilarious thing in the world, and here we could die from them. Right? You could sneeze the wrong way and life end. You could breathe in bacteria or an unseen substance and life ends. We are fragile, and so please spare me that you're working out and eating greens. Now, please know, I'm not saying we shouldn't work out and eat greens. I'm not trying to take Brian out of a job here with Planet Fitness. But by the way, the Bible does call us to be good stewards of our body. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. We are to take care of our bodies. But let's be honest, we're not going to lengthen our life. We are in bondage. We are enslaved to death. That's our biggest concern, is it not? We want death to be overcome. We want it out from this. In fact, it says we are enslaved to it. I love the description in verse 15. We are in bondage to this. 1 out of every 1 person is going to die here, lest the Lord return. And death has a way of shocking us. It has a way of subduing us. It has a way of sobering us to the reality that we are not in control. We live in a world where we are not in control. We had dominion, but we lost it because of sin. We have no control. And for most of us, here's what we do. Our instinct as humans is to repress it. Our instinct is not to talk about death. Yeah, we go to a funeral, but even at the funeral, I've been to funerals, we don't talk about the death of a person. We talk about, how's your day going? How's the job doing? What are we doing? We're talking about things that we fill our lives with because we don't want to have to deal with death. We don't want to deal with the reality of the emptiness that death brings us to. We'd rather talk about taxes than talk about death. By the way, taxes are the only other certain thing in life, isn't it? Taxes and death. Now, if there is no resurrection, if there is no life after death, that leaves us pretty hopeless, doesn't it? If death is the end, then everything that we do makes no sense and makes no difference. That's why there is a yearning, even in the greatest atheists, to have life after death. It makes sense. We want it. We desire it. We might not believe it, but we want it. We want there to be a resurrection. There's a hunger for this resurrection. Now, this is our problem, but notice what it says. I love verse 9. We look around the world, there's nothing in subjection to us. Notice verse 9. Let's go back. We were in control, and now you don't see any control, and the reality of that is that we were enslaved to death. Death is going to happen, and we fear it. We're afraid of it. We don't like it. We don't want to hear the C word. We don't want to hear about cancer. We don't like this. Notice what he says, verse 9. But, and I would say this is a big but of the Bible, but we see who? We see him, Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels. Wait a minute, does that sound familiar? He just quoted Psalm 8 in verses 6 through 8, and now in verse 9 he brings it back, and now he's going to read Psalm 8 through the lens of Jesus. And he says, yes, man was made with dominion, made a little lower than the angels, and was given dominion so that everything was under his feet. But they lost it. We lost it because of sin. But Jesus was then made a little lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Jesus conquered. In fact, go to verse 14. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. And I love this, verse 15, and deliver us. That means to carry us. To carry us, to deliver us from fear of death because we were enslaved to it. Jesus did that by walking out of the grave. He conquered our fear. He conquered our discouragement. He conquered what holds us back, our problem of sin and our problem of death, by walking out of the grave, by dying on the cross and walking out of the grave. He did this for us. Now, you know what's interesting? In the first century, the debate that they had was not about whether Jesus was God or not. They didn't question that. Clearly, only God could rise from the grave. The question they asked was, how could Jesus be human? The big debates that happened in the first century was how could Jesus rise from the grave as a human? So the writer of Hebrews is saying, let me make sure you understand, Jesus was absolutely fully human when he walked out of a grave, and yet he was fully God. This mystery of the deity of Christ, that he was God, but he was also man. Don't forget that he came as a man, that he came in human form. That was the debate of the first century. How could he have been a man? There's no way a man could walk out of the grave, but he did it. Now, what I want to do, I want to pause for a moment, because this is right. Who we were, dominion. What happened to us, what we became, fear, slavery, death. What Christ did is came, died on the cross through his suffering, walked out of the grave, conquered our fear, conquered death, conquered sin, our problem. God, in his great mercy, took care of our problem. Now, the question is, because we know that, is how does Jesus qualify to have the right to be in control of our lives? If we lost control, but we act like we have control, how is he qualified to have the control since he rose from the dead? I want to show you, because there's 3 descriptions that this text gives us about Jesus. And this morning, this sermon is all about Christ, who Christ is. Because if we grasp the reality of Jesus Christ, we grasp the reality of the resurrection. Take a look at what it says. Take a look here. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, notice this, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of his death. You know what it says there? It says, first of all, we have a king, and there's a clear-cut description. He is crowned with glory and honor, a king who cares for us, a king who comes down, a king who is willing to suffer. Let's just grasp that for a moment. Why does Jesus have the right to fill our lives? Why does he have the right to make the difference in our life? Why does he have the right to have all the say in how we live? The answer is because he's the king who came to us. And he's a king who came to suffer. In other words, he heard our screams of the problem of sin and death. He heard our cries, and he delivers. He comes. The king leaves his throne and comes to earth for us. And it says, I love the end of verse 8 or verse 9, so that by the grace of God he might taste death. The word there literally means he ate it. By the way, you can't just taste death, you have to eat death, right? And that's what the word means here. It's not just that he tasted it and let it go, it's that he ate it and he conquered it. I know when my wife makes something, I can't just taste it. I go and I eat it. She might say, hey, you want to taste this, but you know what? I take that as an invitation to eat it. You want to taste the cookie? Sure. That's the image here. Jesus, it wasn't just tasted, it was that he ate death for us. He partook of death on our behalf. The king took death upon himself. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, listen, you know the God of the mountain, the God of Olympus, you know the God of Apollo, you know those false gods that the world follows? Where are they at? They didn't come to you. They don't respond to you. They have no mouths to speak. They have no eyes to see. They have no action in your life. But Jesus was a king who came. This God came out of the mountain of heaven and came to earth for us. He is a king who is worthy of our lives because he can fill us. He has the right to fill us. And by the way, a king who would die for his subjects says more about the king than his subjects. It is that the king absolutely loves his subjects to be willing to come and die for them. Notice the second description. He is king who came to suffer. Verse 10. For it was fitting, by the way, I love that. That word actually means obvious. For it was obvious that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, and bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Now, I love this. He says the second description of Jesus, the why he has the right to fill our lives, why his qualifications overwhelm our life, should overwhelm our life, is secondly, he is only a king who has suffered for us. He is a champion who has fought for us. Do you notice what it says there? It says, for it was obvious, I love that, for it was fitting, it's obvious, that the one who created all things, in order to bring us to glory, in order to restore in us what we were, should come as a champion. The word there, literally, you might have the translation that says pioneer. The word actually is the word champion or captain. Here's what it means. It's the word arpegos or archipegos, which means, it means champion. It means pioneer is a great word for it. The idea of an archipegos was a warrior who was the number one warrior in an army. This is how it would look. If you were to go into battle, every army has a champion, right? Remember the story of David and Goliath? Remember the Philistines had a champion called Goliath. And what do? They sent him into battle first. The champion goes into battle. If you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movie, who goes into battle first? You usually have Aragorn, right? Who runs ahead of all the others. Why? That's what the champion does. He runs ahead. He paves the way. He fights the battle. That's the picture here. Jesus not only was fighting the battle of the enemy, his own battle, but he looked at you and I and he said, they're losing. And he says, I've got this. And it's like he bulldozes through the enemy and says, I'm going to pave the way of victory. Follow me. That's the word here, champion. He is a champion who has fought for us. He sees that we're afraid of death. He sees that we're overwhelmed with sin. And he says, I have gone before you. I have paved the way so that you don't have to fear death anymore. That you don't have to be discouraged anymore. You don't have to be overwhelmed in sin anymore. I have conquered it. I have championed it, right? We are more than conquerors in Christ. That's the image here. Why are we more than conquerors? Because it's in Christ who is the champion. He ran ahead of us. He fought the battle. He won the victory. He has fought what we could never fight. He's a champion. Notice the last description. I want to focus on this for a moment. Verse 11, for he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. By the way, I love that this does not just relate to salvation, does it? It uses the word sanctification. Why? This is not just what you need for salvation. This is what you need to live a life of salvation. This is going to make you grow in your faith, is to know this about Christ, to live this with Christ. And notice what he says next. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. this last description of Jesus as to why he's qualified to fill our lives due to the resurrection is because by the resurrection, he is now able to say, you're my brother. Now, you and I might take this little statement and go, well, who cares? All right, he's my brother, I get that. And the reason is we live in a culture not really based upon family. In fact, we are one of the only cultures in the history of the world that does not put great emphasis in family. Read history, you see that even the Roman culture put great stock in family relationship. In fact, in many parts of the world today, if you go there and you ask them, who are you? Now let me give you a little test here for a moment. I'm going to say a name, and I've done this before, but just for the sake of maybe you're here and you haven't been here, let me do this again. I'm going to say a name. I want to tell me who they are, right? Tiger Woods. Who is Barack Obama? Be nice, Sal. Who is Dave Vance? Okay, who? Allison's husband. Yeah, that's right. Now listen, we could be here all day, follow me, all day, and I could say who is, and every time, you know what you're going to tell me? You're not going to tell me who they are, you're going to tell me what they do. You know why? Because we live in a culture that is wrapped in our resume. We're wrapped in building our status based upon all that we've done. So you know what we do? We have these conversations. Oh, what do you do right now? Well, I'm a salesman. I do this and that. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I do this and that. Oh, what do you do? I do. It's always based upon what we do. Now follow. In their day, everything was based upon your genealogy. It wasn't what you did. It was who you were from. That's why the genealogy of Jesus is so special, so powerful. When you would ask the person who they are, they would say, I am Dave, the son of Dave, and mom, Eleanor. They would give their genealogy because that's what made them who they are. That based their life. So they would list their genealogy, and if anybody disrupted the genealogy or was a bad name, part of the curse of that person would be they'd wipe it out. They would say, no, we're not counting them as part of our family anymore. And some of you are like, I like to do that. There's some family, do not look over at your family today. I like to wipe them off the face. Jesus here, now follow. Jesus had the genealogy that held a Rahab the prostitute, that had the genealogy that held Ruth a Moabite, pagan woman. Jesus' genealogy had kings who failed deeply, and Jesus is saying, I'm willing to put you in my genealogy. He's saying, I'm willing to call you brother. And that was conquered by the resurrection. Because he conquered our fear of death, because he conquered our sin, he says, now you can be called my brother. I can call you brother. In fact, he says here, I would be proud to call you my brother. Now, please know, that's not saying what he did but he's saying, I'm a brother who wants you. I'm a brother who wants you. He says, I want you to be part of my genealogy. Now, you might be here this morning. You might say, hey, listen, I've got struggle with sin. I've got a bad story. You don't know where I've came from. Isn't the resurrection the ace of spades in the reign of sin and death? Isn't the resurrection exactly what says to us that you can say this morning, it has been paid for? You might say this morning, listen, you don't understand my story. You don't understand my struggle. You don't understand who I am. Isn't the resurrection the thing that says God doesn't care who you are? He can make you by his power what he wants you to be? Doesn't the resurrection say that your rebellion was absorbed on Jesus? Doesn't the resurrection proclaim that it has been paid for? Listen, normally you and I might think Jesus died, but was it enough? Was it enough for my bad self? Was it enough for my life? And here's Jesus saying, no, I want to call you my brother. I want you to be a part of my genealogy. I want you to be in my family. I'm not only a king who suffered, I'm not only a champion who has fought, but I'm a brother who wants you. I want you, and the resurrection is the confirmation of his desire to demonstrate his love and saying, I went to the cross, but I also conquered what you couldn't conquer. I'm king, I'm champion, and you can call me brother. You're here this morning, you're afraid, you're discouraged. Listen, Jesus' resurrection shouts truth with certainty, louder than any and every doubt and fear. You're here this morning and maybe you feel the lack of control in your life. That's exactly the point. You can't submit to yourself. You can't have dominion over this earth. You give in to the dominion of Jesus and the fact that he conquered what we couldn't conquer. Maybe you're saying, listen, I'm afraid of the future. I don't know what it holds. I don't know what the economy is going to be like. I don't know what my life's going to be like. I don't know what my kids are going to be like. I don't know what this is all going to be. Isn't that the point? He's a champion. He's gone before us. I'm overwhelmed with this thought. He's gone before us. And listen, remember the world was under our feet, but we lost it. And guess what? He's saying there will be a day where the world will be under our feet again. And he said, I've ran ahead and already secured it. And the resurrection takes every bit of discouragement from me because I know it has been paid for. Now, I want to end with this thing. One last thought, and then we're finished to bring this back to our lives. I want you to go to Hebrews 2:1 because this passage, and we're looking at this backwards. He conquered the grave, right? He did this for us. He is our king. He's our champion. He is our brother. And this is where he starts in Hebrews 2:1. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. You know what? The writer of Hebrews understood that we are a people accustomed to hearing this thing. We've had dozens of Easters, and yet we so easily drift away. We so easily drift away. It's funny, I was on a plane in February. I went to Nicaragua 4 times last year, and so I spent some time on a plane, and some of you fly. That's what you do. You go places and you fly a lot for your job. I don't fly very often, but when I do, I've been on a plane enough where something really hit me the last time I flew on a plane, that no one pays attention to the stewards and stewardess when they're giving the instructions of emergency stuff. So they begin, right? They pull out the seatbelt and say, make sure your seatbelt stays fastened at all times. You'll find that if we lose altitude, an oxygen mask will fall from the top. You please put that oxygen mask on before helping somebody else. Even though the bag will not inflate, it still will be having oxygen come through. Make sure you pull the straps tight and help those around you that may need it. There are lights, emergency lights around the back, on the side. In case of an emergency, you'll see these lights lit up. You can then exit the emergency doors at the instruction of the stewardess. Now, at this point, no one is paying attention. No one is paying attention. Everybody's talking. No one cares. And in fact, even the stewards and stewardess don't care. They're up there like, And what we want to do as people, right? Our instinct is, I want to recline my chair and I want the pretzels because I can't have peanuts anymore because of allergies. I want the pretzels and I want the soda and I'm happy. I want to take a nap. That's what I want, right? So we celebrate a dozen resurrection days, and it's so easily become noise in the background of our lives as we try to recline and eat our pretzels. May the resurrection be what fills our journey with Jesus. May the resurrection be what causes us to live a life of obedience. May the reality of Him being our King, who suffered for us, our champion who fought for us, and our brother who wants us to lead us in an imperceptible current toward godliness and toward Christ-likeness. May we not drift away from the reality of the resurrection lived out in our lives. Can I share with you, heaven never tires of hearing about the resurrection. We sang a song this morning that actually came from the scriptures. Think about this: day and night, heaven sings, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Heaven never stops talking about the resurrection and never stops talking about the cross. Are our lives wrapped in the fulfillment of the resurrection? Let's stand together as we pray this morning.